Your CPU is secretly more memory than a calculator. Over half the transistors on modern chips are cache, not compute, because a single missed fetch stalls everything for dozens of cycles. Today, I'm breaking down every type of digital memory and how this invisible speed war shapes your entire PC, starting with the fastest memory you own, CPU cache. Your processor's cache is basically a desperate speed trick. L1 sits inside each core and responds in 1 to 3 cycles. L2 takes 4 to 10. L3 shared across all cores costs 10 to 40 cycles. Main memory, 60 to 100 cycles minimum. On a 3 GHz CPU, that is 0.3 nanoseconds for L1 versus 20 to 33 nanoseconds for DRAM. That gap is so brutal that data placement matters as much as clock speed. Think of it like a desk. L1 is the papers under your fingers right now. L2 is the desk surface. L3 is the shared credenza behind you. RAM is walking down the hall. Every core has its own desk, which creates a problem. If two cores hold copies of the same data and one changes it, the other is wrong. Cache coherence protocols like MICI solve this by snooping bus traffic and invalidating stale copies, keeping everyone synchronized without a fistfight. But at least the cache is still on the chip. Wait until you see what happens. Step off. System RAM. System RAM is your computer's desk. Everything you're actively working on sits right there, ready to grab. But the second that desk overflows, your OS panics, starts shoving paperwork to the slow filing cabinet down the hall. That's called paging, and it absolutely tanks response. DDR5 was supposed to fix this bottleneck, and it did, kind of. At DDR5 6400 speeds, you get roughly 51.2 gigabytes per second of bandwidth per channel. That more than doubles DDR4. But here's the kicker. Latency, still sitting around 14 nanoseconds, basically flat across generations. Turns out, faster mega transfers don't automatically mean quicker access, they just mean a wider pipe. The data moves in greater volume, but the wait time before it starts moving hasn't budged, which is, not ideal. DDR5 did get clever. Each DIMM splits into two independent 32-bit subchannels, letting the memory controller juggle parallel requests way better. And capacity? GDEC specs allow up to 512 gigabytes per DIMM, an 8-fold jump from DDR4's 64 gig limit. But that bandwidth versus latency tension is exactly why bigger numbers don't always mean bigger wins. A Ferrari engine doesn't help in a traffic jam. And speaking of engines that need feeding, let's look at the memory that keeps your GPU from starving RAM. Your GPU doesn't care about latency, it cares about bandwidth. An RTX 4090 straps 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X across a 384-bit bus, moving over 1 terabyte per second. That is not a sports car, that is a freight train. GDDR6X uses PAM4 signaling, jamming 2 bits into every symbol instead of 1, hitting 21 gigabits per second per pin, nearly double standard GDDR6. But that bandwidth comes with a brutal cache. The latency numbers are ugly. L1 cache responds in about 30 cycles, L2 takes 150 to 200, VRAM itself 400 to 800 cycles, and 800 cycle wait should absolutely stall your graphics card. Turns out, no. When one group of threads stalls, the scheduler simply switches to another warp whose data is ready. It hides those waits by juggling thousands of threads. Magic? But that magic shatters the second you exceed your VRAM capacity, run out of room, and the driver pages assets over PCIe to system RAM, which is exponentially slower. Your 60 frames per second instantly becomes a stuttering slideshow, which is exactly why confusing VRAM capacity with VRAM speed is dangerous. More gigabytes means more room for assets, more bandwidth means feeding them faster. Two entirely different problems, which is also exactly the battle NVMe SSDs face every single day. NVMe SSDs and NAND flash, your SSD is lying to you. Every time you save a file, the drive secretly shuffles your data around like a paranoid smuggler. NAND flash locks electrons in tiny boxes, but here's the catch. NAND physically cannot overwrite data in place. To change a single byte, the drive must erase the entire block surrounding it before writing anything back. This erase before write rule limits program might erase cycles per cell. Consumer TLC drives endure 1/500 to 3000 PE cycles, translating to 300 to 1200 terabytes written over a 1 TB drive's lifetime, which is, not ideal. But wait, how does this ticking time bomb feel so fast? Because the flash translation layer is pulling off the most aggressive juggling act in your system. It maps logical blocks to physical pages, handling garbage collection and where leveling completely invisible to the OS. Your computer thinks it's writing to the same spot, but the FTL silently redirects everything to fresh pages. And here's where it gets weird. If that FTL mapping table corrupts, your drive appears completely dead. Even though your data sits perfectly intact inside the NAND cells, the table of contents just evaporates. When NVMe cranks this over PCIe 4.0 x4, the numbers get absurd. 7,000 megabytes per second sequential throughput, over 10 times faster than SATA SS. Access times drop from milliseconds to tens of microseconds, making game loads feel basically instantaneous. But if you think your SSD is neurotic, wait until you see how we store data using literal lasers. Optical storage. Optical discs are basically diffraction physics turned into consumer electronics, and nobody realizes it. The entire format war from CDs to Blu-ray comes down to one simple principle: have the laser wavelength, quadruple the capacity. CDs read data with a 780 nanometer infrared laser. DVDs drop that to a 650 nanometer red laser. Blu-ray went all the way down to 405 nanometers violet. Each shrink let engineers cram roughly 4 times the linear bit density into the same spiral track. A single layer Blu-ray disc holds 25 gigabytes with individual pit dimensions around 150 nanometers. BDXL quad layer variants hit 128 gigabytes on the exact same 12 centimeter disc, which is, you know, absurd. Here's where it gets complicated. Discs don't literally engrave ones and zeros. They encode data as pitland patterns read by laser reflection, then use run length limited codes like NRZI to ensure the drive's clock stays synchronized despite dust, scratches, and manufacturing defects. But the real divide is longevity. Cheap burnable discs with organic dyes rot in years. Meanwhile, archival grade media with inorganic layers like M-Disk can retain data for over a century, outlasting typical hard drives and consumer SSD. Data centers actually exploit this. Robotic optical libraries hold petabytes on shelves of disks while consuming nearly zero power when idle, perfect for cold archives. But if you think optical physics is wild, wait until you see how we store data on spinning magnetic platter. Magnetic storage. Hard drives are the storage equivalent of a record player. If the needle hovered nanometers above the vinyl at 7,200 RPM and the vinyl was covered in microscopic magnets, that is literally how they work. Spinning platters, magnetized domains, and a read-write head flying so close to the surface that a fingerprint is a catastrophic mountain. But here's the problem. Actually, finding anything means physically moving an arm and waiting for the disk to rotate. Average seek time on a desktop drive is about 9 milliseconds. Rotational latency at 7,200 RPM adds another 4.17 milliseconds of just waiting. Combined, you are looking at 10 to 15 milliseconds to grab a random bit. That is roughly 2,500 times slower than DRAM. But here is the kicker. Once that head is in position, reading consecutive sectors costs 0 extra time. Sequential transfer rates hit 100 to 250 Hasnine because the first bit in a sector is the most expensive, the rest effectively free. That gap between random and sequential is why hard drives feel completely fine streaming a massive video file but absolutely miserable booting Windows. And then there is tape. LTO9 cartridges pack 18 terabytes raw capacity at 400 NIL-bias native transfers. Tape libraries store petabytes to exabytes for cold storage, with robot arms shuffling cartridges behind cloud interfaces you use every day without realizing it. Cost per terabyte crowns Magnetic Media King, and Hammer pushes it further by using localized laser heating to shrink magnetic grains to absurd densities. But all those spinning platters and robot arms still need instructions to even exist. Which brings us to the tiny memory that tells your computer what it actually is. CMOS and BIOS memory. Your computer has a brainstem, and it runs on a coin cell battery worth about $3. That tiny battery keeps a sliver of CMOS memory alive while the machine is unplugged, storing configuration settings like system time and boot order, Without it, your PC literally forgets who it is every time you pull the plug, and I can prove it. Pull that battery out and your motherboard panics, reverting to factory defaults and begging you to set the clock. Here's where it gets weird. A lot of people think the BIOS lives inside that battery. Turns out, no, the actual firmware, whether it's legacy BIOS or modern UEFI, lives in a completely separate chip on the motherboard. That's typically 16 to 32 megabytes of reprogrammable flash, or EEPROM. The battery just keeps your settings alive. Clearing CMOS resets your configuration, not the code. The firmware is completely intact, which is, not ideal when you've spent 3 hours dialing in a perfect overclock. That distinction is critical. UEFI firmware is the modern replacement for those old blue text menus, and it brings guide partition table support, secure boot, richer drivers, and actual graphical interface. But the fundamental asymmetry remains. A few kilobytes of settings in CMOS can render a machine completely unbootable, while the 32 megabytes of firmware code act as the literal brainstem. Without it, the CPU powers on with zero instructions on how to initialize hardware or find a bootable operating system. Small structures, huge consequences, but if you think a misconfigured boot order is frustrating, wait until you see what happens when your operating system starts treating your storage drive as extra RAM virtual memory. Every program running on your computer thinks it owns the entire machine. It sees one massive, perfectly contiguous block of memory all to itself. Turns out, no. The operating system is lying to every single process simultaneously. Virtual memory is a beautiful con. The OS and the MMU take scattered chunks of physical RAM, map them onto a process's virtual address space using page tables, and make it all look seamless. Each program gets its own private universe, which also zero process can read another's memory. Security isolation built right into the... But here's where it gets complicated. When a program needs data that isn't currently sitting in RAM, you get a page fault. The OS pauses everything, picks a victim page, evicts it to disk, loads the requested page into the freed space, and updates the maps. This lets you run programs that collectively need way more memory than you physically have. The cost? Disk is thousands of times slower than DRAM. When your working sets grow too large and the system starts thrashing swap, constantly paging in and out, your computer practically freezes. Naturally, the internet found this and decided disabling the page file improves performance. It does not. It just prevents graceful paging and forces sudden crashes when RAM exhausts. But if you think the OS is the only one juggling invisible memory, wait until you see what your peripherals are hiding. Every peripheral plugged into your computer is secretly its own computer, and that has terrifying implications. Buffers and ROM. Your printer is lying to you. When you hit print, the computer blasts an entire page of data into the printer almost instantly, then completely disconnects and moves on with its life. The printer slowly renders that page at its own mechanical pace. The magic making this work is a buffer, a temporary memory region that sits between two devices operating at completely different speeds. Buffers store original data in transit to smooth out flow control. This is fundamentally different from caching, which stores copies of data likely to be reused for pure speed. People constantly conflate the two, but buffering is about smoothness while caching is about speed. Then there is the ROM inside your peripherals. Every USB keyboard, every hard drive, every network card has a tiny chip holding firmware that defines its entire personality, from keyboard microcode to disk servo control and error correction. But here's where it gets weird. That ROM is not actually read-only anymore. Modern peripheral ROM is reprogrammable flash, or EPROM, which is why you can update device firmware to fix bugs and patch security vulnerabilities. Cool, right? Turns out, no. This means bugs or backdoors in device firmware persist across OS reinstalls and survive antivirus scans entirely. A firmware level attack is basically invisible to your operating system, so your peripherals are independent computers running their own code, which is, not ideal. But if you think that is unsettling, Wait until you see how far this memory hierarchy extends into cloud data center. You upload a file and it just appears in the cloud magic. But behind that upload button is the most absurdly complex memory hierarchy on the planet, and it's hiding some deeply uncomfortable secrets. Cloud memory. Cloud providers organize into regions and availability zones, isolated facilities ensuring one thunderstorm doesn't kill everything. But the storage tiers inside are where it gets wild. They mirror your computer's memory hierarchy, just warehouse size. Hot data sits on SSD front ends, cooler data gets shuffled to HDD arrays, and cold archives, those drop onto tape libraries, actual magnetic tape loaded by robots hiding behind slick cloud APIs. Your fancy cloud upload is literally just a tape deck with extra steps. Providers love throwing around 11 nines of durability, 99.999%. Sounds incredible. And it is, for hardware failures, they replicate your data across multiple facilities to ensure a dead drive doesn't kill your files. But here's the kicker. That stat does absolutely nothing if you accidentally delete your own stuff or someone compromises your account. Redundancy is not a backup. People treat the cloud like an infallible safety net, but it's the same physical media with the same failure modes, just replicated by professionals. Then there's the energy problem. Cooling accounts for roughly 40% of a data center's total energy consumption. 40% just keep the building from melting, but the real bottleneck, network latency. That back-end SSD might read your data in microseconds, but you're sitting at home 1,000 kilometers away, eating tens of milliseconds of round-trip delay. The storage is fast, the pipe is slow. But if you think cloud architecture is complicated, wait until you see the tiny chips that actually let your hardware remember who it is. Everyone thinks firmware is set in stone, but it literally isn't. Your hardware's entire personality lives in non-volatile memory that can be rewritten, and that fact changes everything. Firmware and EEPROM. EEPROM stores data using trapped charge inside floating gate transistors. No power, no problem. The bits just sit there. But unlike older EEPROM chips that you literally had to pull out and blast with ultraviolet light to erase, EEPROM erases electrically right in the circuit down to single bytes. That byte level precision is its superpower. You can tweak one calibration constant without rewriting the entire chip. The trade-off? Size and speed. EEPROM cells are relatively big, writes are slow, and each cell only survives around 1 million erase cycles before the hardware just says no. They retain data for 10 plus years, which is plenty for configuration settings and small firmware images. Here's where it gets complicated. Flash memory is technically just a high-density EEPROM variant, but optimized for speed and capacity by erasing at the block level instead of byte by byte, 1 transistor per bit instead of 2. That trade-off is why your SSD and USB drive exist at all. NOR flash gives you fast random reads and bit addressable writes, perfect for executing code in place. NAND flash requires block operations and controller logic, but scales to massive capacities, and this is where the blur between hardware and software gets dangerous. Firmware updates extend device lifespans and close security holes, but they also open the door to persistent malware that survives OS reinstalls, or complete bricking if the power cuts out mid-update. Your device behavior is literally code in non-volatile memory, and anyone who can change that code owns the hardware. But if you think rewriting silicon is wild, wait until you see how researchers are storing data in molecules and quantum state. Quantum and DNA data storage. We've reached the absolute extremes of memory. One exists for milliseconds and represents exponential computational power. The other could outlast human civilization and store the internet in a test tube. First, quantum. A qubit in superposition can be both 0 and 1 simultaneously, which means n qubits can represent 2 to the n basis states at once. That is genuinely absurd computational power. But here's the kicker. Current quantum systems hold coherence for roughly 100 milliseconds before decoherence destroys everything. You get about 1/10 of a second before your data vanishes into noise, which is, not ideal. And quantum error correction makes it worse. To get one reliable logical qubit, you need to spread its information across hundreds to thousands of physical qubits. Estimates range from 100 to 10,000 physical qubits per logical qubit for commercial use. So Quantum memory cannot replace RAM. It's a computer resource, not a storage one. DNA storage is the complete opposite. Instead of charge in a transistor, you encode bits into nucleotide sequences A, T, C, and G. Theoretical density hits roughly 215 million gigabytes per gram, or up to 455 exabytes depending on coding. Researchers built a prototype DNA cassette tape, half a mile of plastic printed with DNA spots, holding 36 petabytes. That is over 3 billion songs on a tape you could hold in both hands. It can locate about 1,470 file positions per second. Sounds fast until you realize encoding and decoding takes minutes to hours, but the durability is where DNA gets spooked. Sealed in protective matrices, DNA data can survive for hundreds of years at room temperature and tens of thousands of years when cooled. Your SSD dies in a decade. DNA outlasts stone tablet. Both technologies are incredible. Neither is replacing your SSD tomorrow, but the extremes tell you everything about where memory is headed. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.